Okay. Welcome to our very first live stream. Thank you all for being here on this lovely Sunday to celebrate International Women's Day with us. What good timing, as I know a lot of people are home and not going out as much today. And yeah. Anyway, I'm Deanna Migdal, the Executive Director of Not My USA. As most of you know, Not My USA is part of a worldwide women's movement empowering women since 1925. We partner with Not My Israel to provide vital education and social services to women and children in Israel. Domestic violence and various forms of abuse are an important part of our work with women and teens in Israel. I'm happy to be here today with Dr. Ilana Kvartin to discuss this topic in detail. But first, a little bit about the history, importance, and relevance of International Women's Day. International Women's Day has been officially observed by the United Nations since 1975, but the day's observance goes back much further, well over a century, starting in the early 1900s in Russia, and continues to grow from strength to strength. The impetus for establishing this day can be traced to protests against poor working conditions for women, abuse in the sweatshops, sexual harassment for women, especially in the workplace, and the struggle for equal pay and equal rights. Interestingly enough, Na'amat's name is an acronym that means Working Women and Volunteers, established almost 100 years ago to help women in the workplace and to fight for social justice and equality. Just as International Women's Day started with action from the women's labor movement, Na'amat also started as a labor Zionist movement. So as you can see, we have a real connection to the celebration of this important day for women. Days like International Women's Day are a time to celebrate the gains that women have made and to measure how far we've come, but also to realize that there are so many more steps we need to take in the struggle for equality. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our very special guest, Dr. Ilana Kvartin. Ilana is currently the Regional Director of the Western United States for the Jewish Agency for Israel. Before moving to Los Angeles with her husband and 4 children to do shlichut for the Jewish people, she had a practice as an attorney in Israel, specializing in women's rights, and received her PhD in gender studies with the help of a Na'amat research grant. We are honored to have her here today to talk about certain forms of domestic violence, non-physical, that are often not talked about. So Ilana, we'd love to hear about your research, but first, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, my pleasure. And again, I hope everyone's watching because you're more at home than you are outside. So we're here delivering this content, and Na'amat being the first organization, and we hope all of the organizations would follow with more online content, providing it for people, and especially on such an important day that we want to talk about women's rights and women's status in the world. Yes, so a little bit about me, maybe like regardless to my research. So I was born in the former Soviet Union, and I grew up as a little girl in a Jewish home in Moscow. My parents were big Zionist fighters. They were dreaming about coming to Israel. And back in the day, in 70s and 80s of last century in Russia, you weren't allowed to leave. The government would not let you leave. And my parents were fighting to try to leave, which is ridiculous, but that's how things were. And my mom, who I call the first, feminist, the first women's rights activist in my family, she applied over and over again to bring her family to the Jewish land, and they got refused. Like every time they applied, they got refusals from the government. You can't go, your job is too secret. You can't go because, just because. Like things were arbitrary. And so for 10 years, they got these refusals until one day in 1987, they finally got the letter that said, okay, you're allowed to leave. You have 10 days to leave, pack all your stuff, say goodbye to everyone and go to Israel. And of course, my parents were saying goodbye to people probably for the last time. They had no idea if they're going to come back and see them, relatives and friends. And you couldn't bring anything. You can bring money or pictures, and you couldn't keep your citizenship. So it was a very traumatic kind of like rescue. And we were rescued by the Jewish Agency to come to Israel, and you couldn't go directly. So we went through Vienna. We were there in a safe home for a few days. And I talk a lot about the Refuseniks movement here in the US, and a lot of people have heard about it because a lot of Americans have been involved in it and have been in delegations in Russia trying to rescue these Jews. So you can say that I'm part of that, the group that was rescued. So I, again, very much am thankful and grateful for all of the work of the American Jewry here. And it's really like funny, you know, like closing the circle today. Today I'm in charge of Aliyah and all of the immigration to Israel of the Western region. So I get to do in the Jewish Agency what kind of saved me as a little girl going to Israel, which I think is great.
Full circle.
Totally.
Yeah.
So I'm really proud to be doing this here. So I grew up in Jerusalem. That's where we got to. I grew up in Jerusalem. I went to school. You know, I went to Scouts, Sofim. It's a youth group. And I went to the army. I was in the Gaza Strip. I was in an observation post. I was also an officer. And right after the army, I was accepted to go as a camp counselor to America. And I went to the East Coast to a reform camp called Harlem. And a lot of times that I talk about it, people know about Harlem. It's one of the largest camps. And at camp, first of all, I met American Jewry for the first time. But second of all, and most importantly, I met BG, today my husband. And we fell in love. He later on made Aliyah, and we started our home in Israel. So we started in, you know, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and about 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, actually, after our first daughter was born, we were looking for a community. So we moved to the south, and today we have a home in the Negev, in the south, in a community called Eliyav. It's a community of secular and Orthodox living together, and we're proud to be part of the founders, and it's a beautiful community that we left about 6 months ago to do this shlichut.
Who's living there now?
We're renting the place to people from the community, and we're excited to come back. And so last August, we came here on this shlichut, on this mission for the Jewish people. It's a mission for 3 years. So, you know, we're here into the first year. So we brought the family, we brought the kids. We're trying to get used to living here.
Happy to have you here.
Okay.
You had mentioned something before about how you remember International Women's Day was celebrated in Russia and what people have done in the past.
That's right. So International Women's Day in Russia is not just a day. It's like the day. And all of the workplaces would sometimes have a day off, even, if you could imagine. So it's not, it was, you know, in that sense, it was nice to live in Russia. In other senses, not. But it's a day off, and people would bring flowers to women.
Right, so men would bring women flowers, and husbands would give them to their wives.
Exactly.
How many of you have gotten flowers today? I didn't. Did you?
I did not get a flower. No, but yeah, but that's the custom, to bring flowers to women.
Anyway, we can start that again.
So
you were an attorney for women's rights for 10 years. And so what prompted you to decide to get a degree in gender studies? And tell us a little bit about what you discovered.
Okay. So yeah, so I initially, my first degree was I was at law school. I was in Hebrew U, and I was going to like a normal, you know, corporate lawyer's career. And one of the first courses that I took was women's rights during my law degree. And I remember how it, you know, opened my eyes. I don't think I knew until that point that there's a difference between men and women. It's not something you experience at home, and it's not something very vivid in your day-to-day life. So that was like an eye-opening thing. But it's not until later that I decided to practice in it and also to go and research it. So at some point, when we moved to the South, I had the opportunity to open my own practice, and I had to choose which is kind of like the area of law that I'm going to specialize in. So I decided to specialize in women's rights and represent women who are going through divorce cases. So you usually represent them in rabbinical court and in civil court. So it's like two parallel ways. And also to represent women at courts who were dismissed for pregnancy and IVF treatment, which is against the law in Israel. So that's something that I did in my...
IVF is against the law in Israel?
No, you can't dismiss someone if they're going through IVF treatment.
Oh, I see.
Which is, I think, a broader defense than ever, because if someone's pregnant, then you know the defense is for like 9 months. You're defending the woman from being fired, right? But IVF treatment, it could be 2-3 years, right? It's a very,
of course, it takes a while.
Yeah. So the Israeli law is very pro-family and pro-women and pro-leaving them in the labor force. And I was proud to be, you know, an Israeli attorney working in that. And then one of my hobbies is Zumba. I'm a Zumba instructor. So I would be, you know, a lawyer in the morning and a Zumba instructor at night. And I went to all these like isolated communities in the South, teaching Zumba to women. And I don't know if any of you do Zumba, you must know that Zumba is such a fun, kind of like energetic dance, lots of adrenaline.
That'll be
And
our next live event.
Yes,
We'll be-
totally. Now that people are staying at home, let's do Zumba live. That's a great idea.
Okay.
So as we were doing Zumba, things kind of like open up. You know, people, after they sweat together, women together, like women groups together, they sweat together and they start talking. And the first thing they start talking about is their marriage life, their kids, their husband, things like that. So I started hearing kind of like more and more stories, and women were starting to feel more and more comfortable to open up. And I remember one day in 2012, I get a phone call from one of these women who was in my class, and she said, I remember you said you're a lawyer for women's rights. I want you to come talk to me. I want to talk to you about something. And this was kind of like the first step or what started my motivation to do this thing, because like I said, I'm a lawyer, you know, and I'm an activist for women's rights. I am not one of those researchers who is trying to go into university and like, you know, teach and research more and publish articles. That's not my motive. My motive was to help women. And so this woman came to me and she said, come hear my story. And I came to her house and I heard her story, and I couldn't kind of like leave that as it was, and I had to go and make the wrong right in a sense. And that's what started my PhD research, again, wanting to help women and be active about it, and not it's like not that I was looking to be a PhD owner in something. It's that I wanted to help a woman like her and find like more stories like that.
It wasn't hard to find more stories, I'm sure.
So basically, so this woman's pseudonym that I used in my PhD is Ricky. So Ricky told me a story like, I'm 30, I have 4 kids, we've been married for 8 years, you know, we live in this house. I'm not allowed to leave the house and drive. I'm not allowed to leave the house and work. I can't even go to the supermarket without him. He'd go with me and pay for me. He goes through my closet, takes out all of my tight clothes and tells me what to wear. Tells me what to cook, where to clean, where his friends come over to our house, he tells me to go away because my opinion doesn't matter. You know, he wants to have sex with me whenever he wants, and so on and so on and so on. She tells this story, and I keep telling myself, like, what am I as a lawyer able to do for her? Because the way she's telling this story is something very gradual, some kind of a development into their marriage, not something that the law or the legal discourse is able to, you know, hunt and frame, kind of thing. And so after leaving her house, I was wondering, wait, is Ricky special? Is she like experiencing something very odd in her marriage? Or is her story similar to many, many more stories? Or is there maybe like a spectrum of stories that women kind of like fall into? And so I asked Ricky and I said, so does he physically abuse you? Does he hit you? Does he use any physical force? And she said, no, I wish he was, because then there'll be a name for it. Then I'll be recognized by the women's shelter. Then the entire like kind of like society, the public would know what I'm going through. Then there'll be a name to what I'm going through, right? And so in a sense, what she was saying is the public is not talking about it. The law doesn't have a word for it. So what I'm experiencing is either kind of like my own nightmare, or am I dreaming about it? Or is this really real? You know, she was really wondering about that. And so I was eager to find more stories to understand kind of like how the phenomena works. So I remember back in the day, I issued, you know, these like posts and all these websites calling for women to come to interview for my research, and I couldn't find women.
So nobody wanted to speak up?
No one. So either no one wanted to speak up, or women didn't see this, or like, you know,
They didn't recognize it in their own
relationships.
Right.
And then I realized that maybe they didn't think of it of themselves. Like they don't see themselves as such. And I had to kind of like dig deeper. And so I started going to lectures and academic conventions, and even, you know, Shabbat dinners with family and friends. And everyone would be like, Ilana, what are you doing today? You know? So I'd say nowadays I'm researching this phenomena, and I would tell them about the story with Ricky. And this way I was able to expose it and tell it to more and more people. And there wasn't a single conversation or a gathering like this that I didn't have someone come up to me and say, hey, you know what? I know someone like that. That's my mother, that's my sister, that's my aunt, that's my friend, that's my neighbor. You should take their phone number and talk to them. And that's how I started finding more and more women. Now, at first, when you come to a woman and say, you know, I got your phone number from so-and-so, and I'd like to talk, right? And the first, really the only question that I would ask in these interviews would be, tell me a little bit about your marriage life. And that was it. And then I would listen for a couple hours to what they had to say. And usually throughout the talking, it would develop into them realizing and hearing themselves talk about it and describe it, that they would be like, wait a minute, what I just told you, is this normal?
Doesn't sound right.
Right, what I just told you, you know, it echoes in their ears suddenly.
Well, if that's their norm, that's what they've been living through, or they saw their mother in the same situation, they would think it was the norm.
Totally,
Yeah.
totally. And also like the gradual, so I ended up building kind of like a model that describes, if you can imagine, like this is, you know, over time, right? So over time, the way the phenomena went is like this, slowly, gradually, with like day-to-day kind of like actions and behaviors. So what is the point that you recognize or make a stop to it? There wasn't a point, because the more this went like this, the more they were desensitized to these behaviors. The more they thought, oh, it's just a little bit worse than yesterday, so it's not so worse, you know, like every day, until at some point they were at the point where like nothing can harm you anymore, right?
And making excuses for it too, I'm
Making
sure.
excuses.
Yeah.
And from what I saw, they were so humiliated, degraded, and so like put down that they were, I call it, they were half of themselves in a sense. So where are you in the situation? And the more time went by, kind of like, you know, this thing was going up and the sensitization was going up. So I think the threshold was kind of like further away, right? I always like say that it's like water on a rock, little drop, little drop, little drop, little drop on a rock. And then after, you know, 100 years, you see that there's kind of like, there's a shape in the rock, and that's not something you can turn back. Like there's no going back from that, right? It's a scar for life. So the same with them, like the more actions and behaviors like this were happening, the more their like self-esteem and their ability to see themselves as independent women was going down and down and down. It's a process. So that's something that the law and the legal system are not able to see. They're looking in a singular event, and so in something that's very framed. And it was hard for them to see this kind of like
physical,
yeah,
one in action that
right.
Somebody ends up in the hospital, somebody's, you know, got a bloody nose or a scar or something.
There's a proof. There's something to look at.
Right. This is no proof. This is over time.
This is over time. Exactly. Something very gradual.
Wow. So you have six parts of the phenomenon,
right,
that you've coined. Well, tell us about your phrase that you've coined, right? The honor-based confinement.
Right. So when you write a PhD, you have to base your findings on an existing theory. So the existing theory is called the honor theory. Basically, it really doesn't matter like kind of like in depth what it says, but really it talks about a sense of honor that people use in their behaviors. And so in the sense of these husbands, right, it's an honor-based confinement because they were confining their women to the home or to regulations or to their own decisions, right, the men's decisions, but it was coming from a honor perspective. Like, how am I going to be viewed outward? You know, how's this woman going to represent me and my status? How am I measured?
It affects them, the control about how their wife affects how they're perceived.
Exactly. Like the wife was just an extension of his own reputation, and also a way to compare him to other men. And it's a zero-sum game, meaning if this man is going up, someone else has to go down, right? And if he's going down, this man is going up, and now he's like higher than him. And this kind of like battle in which the women were just a tool.
Yeah, the pawns.
The pawns, correct. And so, you know, if you tell your woman what to wear, or you tell her to cook well, or you tell her not to work so that she has more time in the home, or you tell her not to leave the house because God forbid if she's going to shame you outside, right? Or if you don't let her control any money. These are all means to keep your status as is and keep your honor. So honor-based confinement is kind of like the theory. And I called it extreme controlling behaviors because I felt that the word violence and the word abuse are not fitting to this new phenomena. These are things that describe something in the past that we discovered. And plus, I always said to the women, you know about domestic violence, and you know about violence and abuse, and they always said, that's not me. I am not a battered woman, and I am not. And so
it's all about perspective.
Yeah, but
and a name for it, like you were saying.
Name. Yeah, exactly. And so the name and the name of a phenomena is really the first step. So to call it extreme controlling behavior also puts it on the man, if you think about it, because battered woman talks about the woman. It doesn't talk about someone else's actions, but extreme controlling behaviors talks about the men. So the women could tell themselves, okay, so that's a good name for the phenomena because that's what someone else is doing to me, extreme controlling behaviors. So that's why I named it like that. And that's why the law that I'm legislating with this phenomena is called the law against extreme controlling behaviors. Because again, I want to put it, it's the shelter for women is to protect the women or to take them away from their lives, right? Or all of these like call numbers that you have to call if you feel something, domestic violence in your home. These are all for the women. Yeah, the hotlines are all for the women. So finally, I want the law to state something about the man's behavior, right? So extreme controlling behaviors, that's the name.
So do you want to just briefly talk about the six?
Yes.
The six different.
Okay, so what was interesting, I think, is if I took all of the stories of all of the women that I interviewed and I could extract kind of like leading themes from all of them, I could then box them into baskets, you would say, right? So there were like 6 baskets in a sense of areas of life in which those stories were occurring, okay? So the first one was verbal emotional, right? All of the words that were used, that's the first basket. The second basket was economical. The fact that usually they didn't know which bank their bank account is in, or how much debt, or how much money there is, and that they had to ask for money from their husbands, right?
They couldn't just pay for things themselves.
They couldn't pay.
Use a checkbook.
Exactly. And sometimes even the man would put them into debt using their name and their signature and things like that. So that's like fraud too. So that's economical. The third one is sexual. So many of them, and that was the point that was hard for me in the interviews, because we were talking about it and they were under the impression, some of them were under the impression that if it happens in the marriage, then it's okay. Even if I don't want to have sex every day, it's okay because we're married. And as we were talking, one of them said to me, she said, wait a minute, are you telling me that I've been raped for 360 times?
Wow.
And it just suddenly hits you that you didn't agree to this and you didn't want it, right? And you didn't will it, but you're married, so you were under the impression. So the third one is
like an obligation.
It's an obligation. Correct. She's like, but I'm his wife.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
Right.
So that was the third one. And then the fourth one, I called it patriarchal. Patriarchal meaning that they were treated as minors. Like one of them would tell me, I would sit next to him, we'd watch the news, and every time I'd have an opinion, he would shut me down as if I was the 4-year-old sitting next to us, right? So treating them as minors in every aspect of life. So that was the fourth one. The fifth one was educational and in the workspace. The fact that a lot of times they couldn't go and study higher education, or if they did, it was chosen for them. I remember one woman saying, I wanted to be an artist. And he said, you cannot go to the art school. You can only go to university and become a teacher, because that's what's going to make me look good, right? So that's the first degree that he referred her to go study. And the same went for work. One of them said, I wanted to be a waitress because I wanted to make, easy money and tips and things like that. I said, no, you're not going to, you know what? You're just not going to work at all, okay? Because waitress is something that's humiliating to me. That was the fifth one. And the sixth one was talking about isolation for family and friends. And so not always was it done very direct. It's not like they said, oh, you can't meet your family and friends. It was more like going over their phones, deleting numbers of people that he didn't like, right? That happened a lot. The fact that they would put tapping devices in the home, and then you would feel like you can't invite your girlfriends and you can't talk to anyone about it. So you might as well just stay by yourself. Tapping devices. In the
and
car
they didn't know, and the woman didn't know?
No.
Wow. That's severe.
Yeah, totally. And then one of them
sounds illegal. There should be a law against that.
But again, it's in the home. One of them, he put tapping and he said, oh, it's for the help, because they had a cleaning person and a cooking place. He's like, I wanted to see how they work. But
like
really,
a nanny cam.
Exactly. But really, he was like going after the wife. Or like one of them said, I wanted to visit my mom. She's 2 hours away. He wouldn't let me visit her. So for months, she couldn't visit her mom, right? So this like isolation thing was done very, again, gradually and like with little acts, but like after months of not seeing anybody or talking to anybody, you say to yourself, you know what? I'm just not going to talk to anybody. Oh, and one of the women said to me, my friend calls me and says, hi, how you doing? And I wouldn't have a good answer for this. So I just stopped, answering these phone calls. Or another one said, my friend used to invite me every Saturday, like to go for a hike with the kids. And I just didn't want to be in the situation where she would ask me, how was my week? And I would have to answer. So I would always decline these invitations.
Wow.
So what happens?
You alienate yourself from your friends and family.
Exactly. So these were the 6 areas that I identified. And like every woman would be higher in different areas. Like one woman would be higher in the economical, kind of like extreme controlling behavior, but very low in the sexual, for example, and vice versa. And so every woman found herself in those 6 areas in kind of like different ways, if you will.
Yeah. Wow. Anyway, at this point, I'd like to invite questions. If anybody wants to type in a question, be happy to answer them. And I just want to mention that we are a 501c3 organization. We don't promote any political candidates or parties, but we do, work on issues that affect women and children. So we will remain C3 friendly. Anyway, here's a few questions. The biggest question that I think, why don't the women just leave? Why don't they file for divorce if they're being so degraded and belittled? And why? And once they recognize this is happening, why don't they just leave?
So first of all, I myself, when I met Ricky, I asked her, so Ricky, do you want to leave? Do you want to get a divorce? Do you need me to help you? Since you don't know where your bank account is and you don't have any money, let me pay for it. I'll open the file for you. Do you want me to get a divorce for you? So she said, no, that's all I know. This house, these 4 walls, these kids, this husband, this identity of mine, that's all I know. That's who I am.
Creature of habit, I don't know what's comfortable. Stepping out of that comfort zone, I guess, was too painful. She wouldn't know where to put herself.
Maybe, but I also like the fact that we as a society say to women, if it's good, stay. If it's not good for you, leave. If you haven't left, that means it's good for you,
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're saying it to women, we don't recognize the complexity of, first of all, marriage life. Second of all, of responsibility and decision making. And third of all, of the fact that all of these phenomena are very vague. These are not things, again, it's not like he threatened you with a knife. It's not like he shot, God forbid.
Yeah, again, it's not an incident. It's not one thing that's happened. It's just this period of time of this emotional abuse.
Correct. So that's one thing. And I also, there was a lecture I gave on this topic, and I had a crowd, I think the women were in their 50s and 60s. And they all said, oh, this is unbelievable. They should have left. I've had, such marriage 20 years ago and I left it and now I'm, happily married. And I was asking them, so is everything so simple in your life? Like, doesn't it happen that one day you feel like you want to stay with your husband, the next day you want to feel like you want to divorce them, and the next day you feel like you want to stay? Like, it's very, like, life is very complicated. It's not black and white. And so I totally understand so some of the women that I interviewed, the divorce was out of the question. But others, it was a means for them to understand what they're going through so that I could help them get a divorce. So it really depends on where the woman stands in this kind of like complicated thing called marriage.
Right. Were any of these women afraid that the men were going to then come, if they left, come after them and physically abuse them?
Maybe, but I did hear from some women, they said, you know what? I'm not afraid because I really rather that he hits me because then things would be clear.
That's a sad statement.
I know, but wow. Totally.
Yeah. Here's another question. So I get the verbal and I get the financial and the sexual, but what again is patriarchal domination?
Patriarchal. Okay, so making them as minors, I guess.
So treating them as if they're children.
Correct. And so if there are kids in the home, he would be treating everyone the same way. The children and the wife would be kind of like one clump of treating them as minors. All of decision-making would be his own. All of the economical decisions, all of the day-to-day decisions, everything would be done by him. Like he would totally disregard her opinion or her part in this partnership.
Right. What are some examples of social domination?
Okay, so the fact that they weren't able to talk to everyone that they wanted to.
their friends and their family.
Friends and
being
family.
isolated.
Right, and not going to gatherings sometimes, or not having the phone available. Some of them, not only that they go through the phones and deleted some contacts, the phones were also taken away from them. So, you know, in our time and day, it's unthinkable.
Yeah, impossible.
Right?
How does that differ from personal domination?
So personal domination would be kind of like in the home, and the isolation would be towards family and friends.
All right. Did you research and study Orthodox as well as secular women?
So it's interesting that you asked that, because I was asking myself the same question, because the Israeli society is very stratified, and has, you know, different kind of like groups. So when I started the research, it was clear to me that all of these kind of like closed communities, closed societies would have honor-based confinement on a higher level because they're already closed and traditional societies, right? So at some point, I had an interview with a woman. She happened to be Orthodox, okay? And I asked her, and she tells me this horrible story, just like everyone else. And at the end of the interview, she says to me, Ilana, do you want me to send this in my kind of like inside groups, to send the fact that you're, you know, looking for interviews? And I said to myself, you know what? Why not? Why don't you send it? She sent it out. Within 24 hours, I had 200 women calling me, email me, text me that they want to get an interview. And I was like, what is this? And all 200 of them were Orthodox. So I was thinking,
were they saying, help me? I mean, is that what they were saying? Is help
they
me?
were saying, I want you to hear my story.
Okay.
I want my story out for other women to hear.
So it was to help other women.
Yes, it was always to help other women, by the way.
Yeah.
And it was amazing because, like you remember in the beginning, we talked about how hard it was for me to find people to interview because they weren't recognizing themselves as that.
Right.
And this one text message suddenly yields, you know, 200 women. So I had to decide at that point that if my research is going to be just about Orthodox women or about the larger society. So I decided for it to be about the larger society and to maybe devote, you know, the next article or the next research to Orthodox women. So I chose, you know, 4 or 5 out of the ones who like referred me, and I interviewed them. And so then statistically, I had women from all kind of like denominations and from all ages and from all geographical areas.
So as you can see, it's pervasive. It's society.
Totally.
Let me see. So you talk about honor in married women, but what about unmarried partners?
So I'm sure it exists, but as I was, you know, interviewing the women, it seemed that the marriage was the point where things escalated. As in, when they were like dating or living together and there were no kids involved, there was no kind of like life together involved, things were not showing up as such. Like maybe today in hindsight, they'd say, oh, I remember these behaviors then. But the escalation point started with marriage and more so with the first child. So, yeah, for sure.
Here's a question from Jan in New Jersey. How can we educate young women to understand their basic rights in marriage?
It's a great question. I actually, I thought about it ahead of time, even before we did this. So as we were preparing, we thought about this. I made sure when I met these women to interview them that I would ask at the end of the interview, what do you think we can do? Like, what could we have done for you? And so I don't know if you know, but in Israel, there's a mandatory class before marriage with kind of like the rabbinates or like the rabbi's wife. So they teach usually about purity.
That's a mikvah, or is that something else?
Well, you have to do that, and you have to go to a mikvah, right? If you're going through kind of like the Orthodox path of marriage, which is the majority of marriages today in Israel still, maybe it's going to change, but you have to go through the path of this class. So if we were able to put this content into these classes, because they're mandatory, right? This would be something very valuable for these rabbinates to teach women. So there was one.
Classes would be so helpful. But what if you're not getting? What about for the non-Orthodox?
Well, first of all, everyone's getting the same marriage, even if you're not Orthodox. In Israel, you have to go through the rabbinical marriage. Unless you do civil. Unless you do civil marriage.
But this year, she's not.
But these are very small numbers, really small numbers. If you want 90% of the society, you have to go to these classes. The second thing, in 11th and 12th grade, usually there's a lot of classes, not towards marriage, but at least it's like before you leave high school. So that's like a good point to also meet up in groups of women and talk about it. And a lot of women had talked about billboards about the media, about the social media as a tool to educate and to expose to women's rights. So these are all the things that we suggest to do.
Yeah. Here's another question from Doris in Canada. Were these women, were their mothers in similar relationships? Did they tell you about that? Or?
So as I was researching, I was also kind of like filling out this biographical description of the women, the husbands, their parents, and everything. Because I wanted to try, it was really hard for me as someone hearing these stories to understand, where is this pervasive? Where is this happening? Let's frame it. Because all of us, we always want to say, oh, it's not my neighborhood.
Right.
You know,
it's happening somewhere else.
It's somewhere else. It's not my friends. It's not someone I know, right?
Yeah.
And so as I was filling out these biographical kind of like tables and comparing, no, there wasn't, you know, something I could say, oh, everyone's parents were from the Eastern countries, or all of their parents were living in villages, or all. I could not say that. Like there was nothing defining. They were so different. Educated, not educated, you know, in rural areas and in urban areas, in Israel, outside of it. Like there's nothing you could say that was the kind of like a generalization.
Right. Did you get the feeling that history repeats itself in this type of phenomenon?
I think kind of like what happened, well, it's the fact that they're married, right? There's something about the marriage institute, and the fact that patriarchal relations, or the fact that men and women, this power relation still exists. You know, as much as we want to think that women's rights have improved or feminism have done, we're still, you know, it hasn't changed, at least in marriage.
We hope we're evolving, but
Totally.
it's a slow process.
Totally.
Thus this holiday, really. This is a special
It's
day.
a great reminder.
Yeah, it is. Here's a question from Linda in Cleveland. Are there any attempts to form groups where these women can come together with a facilitator to help build their self-esteem and give them tools to handle issues and how to respond to their spouse?
Right. So it's again an interesting thing. So first of all, the women don't identify themselves as such. So for them to go to a group, that means they first need to name it for themselves. So the naming process. Second of all, a lot of them said, I would go to therapy, but I can't afford it. And he holds all the money, and I can't tell him that I'm going to therapy or that I need the money. So it's a cycle, right? And some of them, their mothers were paying for their therapy. And then the question is like, wait a minute. So your mom is paying for your therapy. What does your mom know? You know, right?
Like how much do they tell them?
Exactly. And so, and they would go to therapy with their mom's funding it. And some of them said, if therapy was free, if the government was saying, if you show, you know, ABC, it's free, I would definitely go. So these are all things that need to be kind of like decided before this.
Yeah. I mean, if the government took more of a part in the emotional welfare of people, it would
Totally
be so much better for everybody. Another question from Sharon in Chicago. Have you studied how well women who do actually leave their husbands, have you studied how well they've done after that, after they've left? Or talked to anybody
So
about that?
I'm in touch with all of the women that I interviewed. Some of them got a divorce, some of them didn't. And it's not like, I mean, being after your divorce is not a happy life anyways. It's a hard life. You're a single mom, you're struggling and things like that. So it's hard to say. I think there was one woman actually who invited me to her second wedding, meaning she left the husband that we were discussing and she went into a second marriage, and she is through the roof happy.
Right, with her eyes wide open, I'm
Exactly.
sure. It's not going to happen to me again.
So maybe that's one answer.
So another question from Brenda, also in Canada. Do any of the 6 areas have legal consequences in Israel or in the United States? Do you know?
They don't. So the law that I drafted is exactly that. So the law that I drafted has, if you can imagine, those 6 areas with behavioral examples, giving the judge and the lawyers the means to examine, is the case in front of me falling into one of those 6 areas and how much. So this law that I drafted is now in Israel's Knesset, waiting to have a government, waiting for the right minister to take it upon themselves. Because in Israel, to promote such a law, I need the help of people in the Knesset. So I'm working on it. Been working for the past 2 years, and I hope it will pass.
When did you submit that? 2 years ago, you said?
Yeah.
And how long does it take for a law to enact?
So last time that I passed a law, it took me 5 years.
What was that law?
So
You passed a law.
I did pass a law. I'm so excited about that.
You should be.
not an exciting topic, but so I remember meeting a woman who had stillbirth and wanted to go back to work the next day. And I said to her, that makes no sense. You just had birth and you're in trauma and you should stay home. And she said, no, but the law doesn't allow me. And we checked, and because she had stillbirth at week 24, according to the law in Israel, she's entitled to no maternity leave, especially not paid. And so I went on this like really long voyage, like I said, 5 years to change the law. Today the law says 22 weeks. So today, if 22 weeks and up, there's a birth, whether the fetus is alive or not, then the mother receives paid maternity leave in Israel. And that is huge.
That's huge.
And so
that is huge.
because I know that it took me 5 years to pass it, I know that those things take a long time.
Yeah. Well, good luck. Can't wait to hear
Thank
about
you.
it, if and when it passes.
I will let you know.
Statistics show that there are over 200,000 battered women in Israel and 500,000 children exposed to domestic violence each year. This is just the reported amount. What are your thoughts about the statistics of, unreported, non-physical violence and other forms of abuse, like things
like the phenomenon?
Yeah, 200,000 are reported.
Right.
What do you think about the unreported and the non-physical?
Well, first of all, the 200,000 totally unreported. Underreported. Underreported. Like maybe 1 of 10 women would go to the police in domestic violence that has physical kind of like signs. In my case, every time I give a lecture or a talk, 20% of the women would approach me at the end of my lecture and say, you were talking about me. And so that makes me think that it's 20% of the population, but I don't have.
That is a huge statistic, 20% of the population.
But I don't have the ability to say, because I didn't do statistics in my research. I can just tell you from talking to people, like how many women come up to me. So it's an estimate.
Yeah, huge phenomenon.
Yeah.
Again, according to statistics, 13 women were killed in 2019 in honor killings in Israel. Do you think that
actually 2 days ago, a 10-month-old baby was killed? Like the father shot the wife and the 2 girls, and one of them died, and the other 2 are injured. So
wow. So it's happening all the time.
It's happening all the time. The numbers are crazy.
So do you think that these numbers could really decrease if women were more empowered, taking classes, learning to recognize these signs of violence, physical as well as non-physical?
Unfortunately, I think it's a systematic thing, meaning our patriarchal world.
Yeah.
It talks about the workforce, the fact that we're paid less, the fact that, there are less women in the Knesset today than there were in the last Knesset, the fact that women are not running companies or governments enough, the way their numbers are in the society. That all kind of like seeps down to the family and to marital statuses. And so maybe that needs to happen first. And also the fact that I think the police has to react faster to women's complaints that not all the time happen because it's underreported.
Right.
But when they do happen, it needs to be in all seriousness, because in all of these killings, you could track back the fact that the police didn't react.
So the women called for help and the police disregarded it
or thought it was a domestic issue.
Oh boy. Anyway, describe the term, the scars that makeup can't cover.
Right. So we sent it out in one of the invitations for this live stream. So one of the women said it to me, and it hit me when she said it, how accurate it is. She said, I have scars that makeup cannot cover. And she means that, with battered women, we all know these kind of like, wearing long sleeves, to cover things here, or maybe gloves sometimes, or like, wearing your head down to not show like here, or maybe like a turtleneck, right? These are women who cover those physical stuff.
Yeah.
And so the women who were talking to me were saying, with my scars, because they're internal in their hearts and souls and in their self-esteems, makeup cannot cover this.
Yeah, that's great. Great term. So here's one more final question. This is a great one. How can we train our daughters? How can we, help the next generation not to be much more empowered and to not allow this to happen anymore?
So I find that us as women, first of all, we have a lot of opportunities to do women gatherings. I think we need to see in every woman gathering, no matter what age or like kind of like what's the infrastructure, the women gathering as an opportunity for women to tell stories, and also to train ourselves and our ears to be good listeners or to be good canvases for those stories to be told, because that's really the first step. I mean, until I met these women in those interviews, they didn't tell it to anybody, and they didn't hear themselves tell it. And I was like their canvas. So we need to allow ourselves all to become those good canvases for our girlfriends, for our women's circles, for our relatives, for our daughters, you know. So I think that's the first thing we need to educate ourselves to do. And also, I think the power and the strength of these like small communities and of women communities happening more and more. So not only in Zumba classes, but also in, you know, in other ways that you could gather women together.
Yeah. Sounds good. Anyway, thank you so much. The subject is so important for us to recognize and for us to explore. And as I mentioned earlier, Alana received a grant from NATMAT when she was getting her PhD a few years ago. Each year, NATMAT awards 200 professional scholarships and research grants to women in Israel who are getting their bachelor's and master's degrees in fields that have traditionally been male-dominated, the STEM fields, science, math, technology, engineering, and law, and getting their PhDs in gender studies. So tell us about how NATMAT helped you in your educational process.
Okay, so I remember it vividly and really thankfully. And again, thank you so much to everyone who took part in this. So I remember I have 4 children, like you said, right? So I have 4 kids, and during my PhD, I gave birth to 2 of them. So if you can imagine, I was like this, you know, like nursing, writing on the computer, or, you know, no, they're like 2 years apart, but they both happened during my studies. And at some point, and I was working full time. And at some point I said to myself, you know what, it's crazy. No one's chasing you. You can write this, you know, it's gonna take you 10 or 15 years, take your time. And I remember talking to my advisor, she said, you know what, take your time, you know, spread it out, write it, you know, in the evenings, whenever you can, da, 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 da. And then I saw this kind of like ad for NATMAT awards. And I said to myself, you know what, I'm gonna try. I'm a person who tries everything. Every ad that I see, I try. I applied, and I was thinking, I mean, thousands of women are gonna apply to this. Like, I'm not gonna ever receive it. And I wrote about my research, kind of like, you know, what I told you, because I was like deep into the interviews.
But you're right, we do get so many, we get hundreds, if not thousands of applications every year.
Exactly, and I knew about a lot of colleagues in my PhD studies who applied also. So it was clear to me that I'm taking this slowly, 10 years of PhD studies, whatever. And to my surprise, I get a call from the committee saying, you know, we were amazed. This is amazing. This is so important to women. You're going to influence so many women in Israel and in the world. We want to support you. And I remember receiving it. And I came, like, if you can imagine, to the ceremony of receiving the prize. I was also I was the speaker in the name of all of the recipients. And this push, this kind of like recognition, the fact that I was seen by the committee and by NATMAT as someone who's doing something important gave me this like final push. And then within 10 months, I submitted my PhD.
Wow.
So it only
gave you the shot that you needed.
It gave me the push I needed. And like the point that I received the award was a point that my PhD was not at all even close to being at all finished, you know, but this like final push that I received, and I worked hard and I submitted it, and you know, thanks to that.
All right. Well, we're so happy to have been a part of your work and to help you. It's so rare that we get to actually meet the people who we help in Israel and whose lives we impact. So, you know, all of our fundraising nationwide for social services and education in Israel, we don't really get to see that unless we go to Israel and visit.
Right.
You know, we don't get to meet the recipients who've gotten our support. So today, you know, we really get to see the difference of all of our efforts that have made across the United States. And that's what makes today truly special, that much more special. So if you donate today to our professional scholarship program, we will match those funds in celebration of International Women's Day. That's like doubling your donation. You can make an impact on the women in Israel, like Alana, who are striving to break the glass ceiling and fight for gender equality to help change the world for women. Please go to our website at natmat.org to make your donation. We appreciate all of your generosity. And remember that all of your donations will be matched dollar for dollar. So one last question, you may be thinking, does this abuse, I know we've talked about it, you know, does it happen only in Israel? Because all of your work was done in Israel. And of course, the answer is no. even though you're Israeli and you're living in America now, do you want to address this and what happens in the United States and what women can do if you think you're experiencing this, or if you know someone, a family or friend who is, being abused?
Yeah, so it's definitely not an Israeli phenomenon, although I'm sure it manifests itself because of the non-separation between religion and state, and the whole marital kind of like control of the rabbinate about it. So it's different in America because you're not afraid of not getting your divorce. But it's not different in a sense that still there's a difference between men and women, the way they are perceived inside of the family. And also the honor-based confinement is something that's embedded in the system. So it happens in every country. It happens here too. And every time I speak about it, I still have 20% of women come up to me and say, this is my story.
Really, that 20% is such a huge number. It's staggering. Anyway, so thank you to everyone who's taken time out of their busy weekends and on this Sunday to be with us today. And with Alana's connection to Na'amat and her unique work in improving the lives of women in Israel, we are very fortunate and delighted to have her here with us today to celebrate International Women's Day, discussing this elusive phenomenon we all should be aware of. And we at Na'amat are optimistic that we can help empower women and affect change in society. You can continue to send me any questions. I'd be happy to answer them. And thank you again to everyone who's joined us. And thank you to Alana. Pleasure having you here today.
Thank you so much. This is such an exciting day for me to do this. So.
Next time, Zumba. Anyway, enjoy International Women's Day and make sure you do something that makes you happy today. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for watching.